The yard was silent, but everyone could feel the storm coming. It was noon at Pelican Bay State Prison, and the sky above the razor-wire fences was a hard, cold gray. Inmates in orange and blue jumpsuits stood frozen in their places, the kind of stillness that only comes before chaos. On the far side of Yard C, two groups faced each other, one with white supremacist tattoos curling down their necks, the other marked by the red bandanas of a Latin prison gang. Between them stood a single correctional officer, shouting commands that no one was listening to. His voice cracked over the radio, "All units, Yard C locked down." But before he could finish, someone yelled a word that changed everything. A homemade blade flashed in the sunlight. Then came the roar, hundreds of men charging, fists, chains, and shanks clashing in the open yard. The officer hit the ground as alarms screamed from every tower. The air filled with the sound of boots, the thud of bodies, and the deep metallic wail of the siren that meant all-out war. It was chaos. Smoke from tear gas drifted across the yard as the first gunshots echoed from the watchtowers. Officers fired warning rounds into the dirt, but it barely slowed the riot. This wasn't just a fight, it was a declaration of power. A white inmate with an Aryan Brotherhood tattoo on his skull lunged at a man wearing red, shouting words no one could make out. The man fell, blood soaking into the cold ground. The riot at Pelican Bay that day would be remembered for years, not because of how it started, but because of what it revealed. This wasn't random violence. It was strategy. It was order disguised as chaos. It was the day when America realized that inside Pelican Bay, gangs weren't just surviving, they were ruling. And deep in the isolation wing, the men who started it all were watching in silence. Their messages had already spread through hidden notes, coded letters, and whispers passed between cells. They had planned every move from inside cages the size of a bathroom. They had built an empire from the shadows. No one knew it yet, but Pelican Bay had become the birthplace of America's deadliest prison gangs. And this was only the beginning. Years earlier, when Pelican Bay first opened in 1989, it was supposed to be the state's solution to uncontrollable violence in California prisons. Lawmakers said it would be a place to contain the worst of the worst, murderers, gang leaders, and lifers who could not be managed anywhere else. The design was unlike any other prison: clean concrete, sterile hallways, electronic doors, and something new, the SHU, or Security Housing Unit. Each inmate in the SHU lived in total isolation, locked in a windowless cell for 23 hours a day. They ate alone, exercised alone, and were allowed no physical contact with anyone. To the outside world, Pelican Bay was seen as a fortress of control. But to those locked inside, it became something else entirely, a breeding ground for organization. Inside those cells were men who had led gangs on the streets, from the Aryan Brotherhood to the Mexican Mafia, from the Black Guerrilla family to Nuestra Familia. The state thought that separating them would break their power. Instead, it forced them to evolve. With no face-to-face contact, the gang leaders began to communicate in secret. They wrote letters in invisible ink made from instant coffee. They hid coded messages in Bible pages and law books. They sent orders through the smallest openings: food trays, legal mail, even tiny holes carved into walls. Every whisper became a command. Every note, a death sentence or a declaration of loyalty. Outside the SHU, the mainline yards became battlegrounds. Young inmates looking for protection joined whichever group would keep them alive. The gangs provided everything: food, weapons, respect. But they demanded absolute loyalty in return. You didn't leave the gang, you either served it or died for it. One of those young inmates was a 21-year-old named Marcus Tone Ramirez. He had been transferred to Pelican Bay after stabbing a rival in another prison. When he arrived, he was given a choice: stand alone, or join Nuestra Familia. Within weeks, Tone was learning their code: discipline, silence, unity. He didn't know that somewhere above him, in a sealed cell, the leaders were watching his every move through reports smuggled by other inmates. Meanwhile, across the yard, the Aryan Brotherhood was growing too. Their leaders, also in the SHU, had built a network stretching across every California prison. They believed violence was power, that control came through fear. And Pelican Bay gave them the perfect stage. One day, a rumor spread: someone had broken the truce between Nuestra Familia and the Aryan Brotherhood. A single stabbing in the cafeteria set off a chain reaction. Officers found coded kites, tiny letters, hidden inside a soap bar, naming targets on both sides. Within 24 hours, the prison was on edge again. Every man in the yard knew something was coming. Tone sat in his cell, staring at the small mirror bolted to the wall. His stomach churned as he thought about what he had agreed to. He wanted to survive, but he also wanted to prove himself. His shot at respect was coming, and he knew it might also be his last day alive. The next morning, the doors opened for yard time. The air was cold, and the yard was divided as always, whites on one side, Hispanics on the other. The guards watched from the towers, uneasy. Even the smallest movement could spark something big. Tone adjusted his red bandana and nodded toward an older inmate beside him. The man slipped a sharpened piece of metal into Tone's hand, wrapped in tape. Tone's heart raced. He looked across the yard and saw 3 men staring back at him, each one covered in tattoos, each one waiting. He didn't need to be told what to do. He already knew. The order had come down from the SHU, passed through layers of inmates until it reached him. This was his test. Tone took a deep breath, wiped his sweaty palms, and started walking across the yard toward his target. Guards shouted warnings over the intercom, but it was too late. He moved fast, the blade hidden by his wrist. The man he was sent to hit was older, tall, pale, with an Aryan Brotherhood symbol inked on his neck. He saw Tone coming and smiled, like he had been expecting it. Then, in a flash, both men moved. The yard exploded. Sirens screamed. Tear gas filled the air again. Guards fired rubber bullets from the towers. Inmates dropped to the ground, covering their heads, but not Tone. He was still standing, chest heaving, blood on his hands, eyes wild. He had done it. But as he looked around, through the smoke and shouting, he realized something horrifying. This wasn't just his fight. It wasn't even about him. He had just started something much bigger. And deep inside the SHU, the real bosses smiled in silence. They had just created another soldier. The war for Pelican Bay had officially begun. The sirens kept echoing long after the riot was over. Tear gas hung heavy in the air, and the smell of blood mixed with burning rubber from riot grenades. The yard was covered in bodies, some moving, some not. Guards stormed in wearing black armor, shouting orders as they zip-tied every man who could still move. Tone was face down in the dirt, his heart pounding so hard he thought it would burst. His hands were tied behind his back, and the taste of metal filled his mouth. He could still hear the gunshots in his head. For a moment, he wasn't sure if the blood on his jumpsuit was his or someone else's. A guard lifted him by the collar and whispered, "Welcome to Pelican Bay, boy. You just bought yourself a one-way ticket to the SHU." Tone didn't say a word. He knew what that meant. The SHU, Security Housing Unit, was where the real power lived. The leaders. The shot callers. The men who ran the prison from behind soundproof doors. Hours later, after being stripped, searched, and thrown into a transport van, Tone felt the van lurch forward. He watched through the narrow slot in the door as the prison yard disappeared behind him. The steel door clanged shut, and the engine rumbled deeper into the complex. When the door finally opened again, he was inside another world, quieter, colder, emptier. A long hallway stretched in front of him, lined with thick gray doors. Each one had a small metal slot barely big enough for a meal tray. This was the SHU. A voice echoed from behind one of the doors, low and calm. "New fish, here?" Tone didn't answer. "Don't worry," the voice said again. "You'll get used to the silence. Everyone does." He was pushed into his cell, a 9 by 11 concrete box with a toilet, a steel bed, and a fluorescent light that never turned off. The door slammed shut behind him. He sat down on the cold floor, his ears ringing in the silence. For the first time, he realized how small his world had become. But somewhere beyond those walls, people were already talking about him. The stabbing had made its way through the grapevine, from cell to cell, through hidden notes, through the guards who carried messages without even realizing it. Tone had earned a name now. He was one of them. 3 doors down, an older inmate named Ghost read a letter smuggled from another yard. The handwriting was tiny, squeezed into the folds of a Bible page. Ghost had been inside Pelican Bay since it opened. He had helped form the communication network that connected every cell, every gang, every order. He smiled as he read the message, "New soldier confirmed. Nuestra Familia approved. Phase 2 begins." Ghost tore the page into pieces and flushed it down the toilet. Then he leaned back and began tapping on the wall behind his bed, slow, steady taps that followed a code only a few inmates could understand. Each knock traveled through concrete and steel, passing from cell to cell, until it reached a man on the far end of the corridor, a legend among the inmates. They called him Santos. He had been locked in isolation for over a decade but still controlled dozens of men across multiple prisons. Every hit, every riot, every truce, it all went through him. When Santos heard the code, he smiled faintly. Another one joins the family, he whispered. Good. We'll need him soon. Days turned into weeks. Tone spent every hour alone, learning to count the seconds by the hum of the light above him. The silence was worse than the violence. He'd lie on his bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the riot over and over in his mind. But he wasn't forgotten. Every few days, a folded piece of paper slid through his meal slot, a kite. Each kite carried lessons, lists of names, codes, and warnings. They were written in riddles, using chess pieces and numbers instead of real words. Tone began to understand. The gangs inside Pelican Bay were more than groups of violent men. They were armies with structure, discipline, and strategy. The leaders had turned isolation into power. One kite read, "A king never leaves his square. The pawns move for him." That was how they saw themselves. The SHU leaders were the kings, the men in the yard were pawns. Every move was planned. Every act of violence had purpose. Even Tone's stabbing, the one that landed him here, had been part of a larger game. One night, as Tone lay half asleep, he heard faint tapping from the vent above his bed. He tapped back, unsure what to say. The taps came again, short bursts, then pauses. It was code. He listened carefully and began to translate. "Do you want in?" He froze. He knew what that meant. Saying yes meant full commitment, no backing out. Saying no meant isolation forever, and maybe death. He tapped twice. Yes. The reply came instantly. Then prove it. Tone didn't sleep that night. He knew a test was coming. In Pelican Bay, nothing happened by chance. 2 days later, a guard came to his cell. "You got rec time." Rec time was rare for SHU inmates, 1 hour outside, alone, inside a concrete pen with no view of the sky. But when Tone stepped into his pen that day, something was different. Across the fence, in the next pen over, stood a tall, bald man covered in white supremacist tattoos. The Aryan Brotherhood symbol was inked across his chest. The man grinned. "You that new kid they talking about?" Tone didn't respond. The man stepped closer to the fence. "You think you're one of them now, huh? Familiar? You don't even know who runs this place." Tone clenched his fists. He could feel the tension crawling up his neck. "Tell your bosses they don't scare us," the man said. "Pelican Bay was ours before your people ever came." Tone's blood boiled. Every word felt like a knife. Suddenly, the man spat through the fence, hitting Tone's arm. Tone snapped. He charged the steel mesh, slamming his fists against it, shouting words he didn't even recognize. Guards shouted from above, warning him to step back, but he didn't stop. He kept hitting the fence until his knuckles bled. The man laughed as guards pulled Tone away. "You're not ready for this game, kid," he yelled. Tone was dragged back to his cell, breathing hard, blood dripping from his hands. His body trembled, from anger, from shame, from fear. Minutes later, another kite slid through his slot. It had one sentence written on it. "You showed fire. Now we'll see if you can use it." Tone stared at the message. He didn't know whether to feel proud or afraid. He looked up at the vent and whispered, "What's next?" For a long time, there was silence. Then came a single tap. One word, the code said. "War." Tone's heart sank. He understood now, the gangs weren't done. What had happened in Yard C was only a test run. Something bigger was coming. Something that would reach beyond Pelican Bay, beyond California, and into every prison in America. And it was going to start with him.